On the day Celeste Ashcroft signed away Caldwell Ridge to a single father named Wade Harlan for $1,234, the entire conference room erupted in laughter. To them, the quiet man in the faded jacket had just bought a graveyard of cracked concrete, a molding terminal, and a tax bill waiting to swallow him whole. But Wade was not looking at a dead runway. He was studying wind patterns, overnight freight corridors, a suspended license that had never been formally terminated, and something buried deep beneath the old operations bunker that nobody else had bothered to remember. 6 months later, Celeste's car would idle at the gate of that same airfield, staring up at a name now blazing across an empire she no longer controlled. The auction hall in downtown Denver smelt of fresh coffee and old money, the kind of room where chandeliers hung low enough to remind everyone underneath them exactly how small they were. Wade Harlan walked in wearing a jacket that had seen better winters, a folder of maintenance notes tucked under one arm, and the quiet posture of a man who had learned long ago not to take up more space than necessary. The receptionist at the door looked him over twice before deciding he must have wandered in from the wrong building, and a pair of junior analysts near the coat check exchanged a glance that needed no translation. Wade ignored all of it because he was not there for chandeliers or company. He had come to bid on a handful of decommissioned generators, a tow tractor, and whatever maintenance equipment Ashcroft Aeronautics no longer wanted, hardware that a man with the right hands could resurrect and resell for honest money. He had done this before in smaller rooms with smaller stakes, and he expected this morning to be no different. Celeste Ashcroft entered the way she entered every room that carried her family name, which was to say like she already owned the air inside E.T. She was there to strip a piece of debt weight off her balance sheet, an old regional airfield called Caldwell Ridge that had not seen a commercial flight in years and existed on the books now only as a liability wrapped in overgrown grass. When she noticed Wade lingering near the folder of Caldwell Ridge documents, something in her expression sharpened with the particular pleasure of a person who has just found a convenient target. She asked loud enough for the room to hear whether he intended to buy an entire airport with pocket change, and the laughter that followed rolled through the crowd like a wave he was expected to drown in. Instead of retreating, Celeste doubled down, offering to sell him Caldwell Ridge outright for the exact figure written on his equipment deposit slip, $1,234, a number small enough to be a punchline and large enough to look official on paper. She meant it as theater, a story executives would repeat over drinks for months, proof that even a broken airfield had more dignity than the man foolish enough to want E.T. Wade went quiet for a long moment, running the offer through his mind the way he ran a pressure gauge across an old engine, checking for the leak everyone else assumed wasn't there. Nobody in that room expected what happened next. Not the analysts, not the lawyers lining the back wall, and certainly not Celeste, who had already started composing the anecdote in her head. Wade signed. The pen barely made a sound against the paper, but it was loud enough to silence the laughter for exactly one heartbeat before it resumed, this time edged with disbelief instead of amusement. Celeste handed him a set of rusted keys with the theatrical grace of someone bestowing a crown on a fool, telling him to enjoy his concrete cemetery and turning on her heel before he could answer. What she did not understand and would not understand for months was that Wade had spent years around airfields nobody respected, learning to read the things that mattered underneath the neglect, the things that never showed up in a boardroom presentation. He walked out of that building holding a key ring instead of a punchline. And somewhere behind him, Celeste Ashcroft was already forgetting his name. Wade drove back to the small rented house on the edge of town where his daughter Mara's school photos lined the refrigerator and the mortgage on his own life felt like a second, quieter airfield he was always trying to keep operational. He did not celebrate because there was nothing yet to celebrate, only a folder of documents and a growing suspicion he needed someone smarter than himself to confirm. That night, he called Mara Whitman, a local attorney with a reputation for reading contracts the way other people read weather reports, searching for the storm hiding inside calm language. Mara's first reaction was concern bordering on alarm because the paperwork he had just accepted was loaded with unresolved land tax, environmental maintenance clauses, and an aggressive provision that usually existed to protect a seller from exactly the kind of buyer Wade appeared to be. But Wade kept returning to one overlooked appendix buried on page after page of standard legal language, a line classifying Caldwell Ridge as a regional auxiliary airfield rather than a fully decommissioned site. If that designation still held, and if the operating license had only been suspended rather than formally terminated, a new owner might be able to petition for reactivation instead of starting from zero, a difference that could mean years and untold amounts of money. Mara had never seen anyone excited about environmental liability clauses before, but she agreed to pull the historical filings first thing in the morning, if only to keep her newest client from walking into a financial cliff with his eyes wide open. Wade thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat alone at his kitchen table for a long while, turning the rusted keys over in his hand like a man deciding whether he had just been given a gift or a punishment. Long before Caldwell Ridge, Wade had spent years working overnight shifts as an aviation maintenance engineer, crawling through the guts of aircraft other people were too impatient to properly diagnose, learning that the difference between something broken and something dead was almost always a matter of attention rather than money. He had watched an entire regional carrier collapse around him a decade earlier, watched colleagues scatter into other industries, and quietly absorbed the lesson that institutions rarely valued the people who kept them running until those people were gone. Raising Mara alone after her mother left had sharpened that same instinct into something closer to discipline, teaching him to measure risk not by what he stood to gain, but by what he could not afford to lose. He never spoke about those years with bitterness, only with the flat, practical tone of a man cataloging lessons rather than grievances. And it was that same tone he carried into every room that ever underestimated him afterward. The first time Wade actually walked the grounds of Caldwell Ridge, the wreckage of it hit him harder than he expected. Even though he had spent his career around aircraft nobody wanted anymore, the main terminal sign hung at a crooked angle, half its letters missing, and the windows facing the old lobby were spiderwebbed with cracks that had been forming for years without anyone caring enough to notice. Weeds had pushed their way through seams in the runway itself, and the air inside the operations building smelled like standing water and forgotten paperwork, the particular scent of a place people had walked away from rather than closed properly. Anyone else standing where Wade stood would have seen only failure, but he found himself measuring the pavement thickness under his boot, checking the compass heading of the main strip, and calculating the distance to the interstate and an old rail spur a few miles out. What Mara saw as a slow-moving disaster, Wade saw as raw material, because underneath the decay was a foundation that had been engineered properly decades earlier and simply left to rot rather than rebuilt. He understood that reputation and reality were two very different things, and that most of the people who had ever looked at Caldwell Ridge had only ever seen the reputation. Mara warned him plainly that the taxes and maintenance obligations attached to the property would consume whatever savings he had within a matter of months if he did nothing, and that timelines in this business rarely bend for good intentions. Wade answered her the way he answered most difficult truths in his life, without flinching and without excess emotion, saying only that he would simply have to bring it back to life before anyone had the chance to bury it for good. It was during that first inspection, while walking the length of the old operations building with a flashlight borrowed from his truck, that Wade found a locked filing cabinet shoved into a back corner room nobody had thought worth cleaning out. A faded label across its front read Federal Relay Access Caldwell Ridge Note in lettering official enough to have once meant something to somebody with real authority. The lock held against his first attempts, and he did not yet have the tools or the time to force it open properly. So he left it exactly as he found it and made a note in the back of his mind instead. He walked out of that building without answers, but with a growing certainty that Caldwell Ridge had once carried more weight in the world than a broken runway and an abandoned lobby. News of Wade's purchase eventually reached Celeste in the form of an internal memo, and her first reaction was laughter loud enough to draw colleagues out of neighboring offices to ask what had happened. She instructed her communications director, a sharp and image-conscious woman named Daphne Vale, to circulate the story internally as proof of just how effectively Ashcroft Aeronautics had cleared an obsolete rural asset off its books. Within days, the tale of the single father who had bought a dead airfield with pocket change became a running joke among investors, retold at dinners and industry gatherings as a parable about the difference between ambition and delusion. Celeste enjoyed every retelling because it reinforced exactly the image she wanted, a woman too shrewd and too powerful to ever make a mistake worth remembering. But underneath the amusement, Celeste had a real plan, one considerably less charming than the joke everyone was laughing at. She expected Wade to drown quietly under unpaid taxes and mounting maintenance costs within a matter of months, at which point a shell company connected to Ashcroft would quietly reacquire the land for a fraction of its original value. That land, she believed, would eventually serve as collateral for an expansion deal she was already negotiating elsewhere, a deal that required exactly the kind of forgotten acreage Caldwell Ridge represented. All she needed to do was wait, let pressure accumulate naturally, and let the humiliation she had engineered do the rest of the work without her fingerprints anywhere near the outcome. The pressure came quickly, and it came from every direction at once, the way financial trouble tends to arrive for people without a cushion beneath them. A local bank declined Wade's application for even a modest loan, citing the property's history and its uncertain legal status. The regional utility company demanded an unusually large deposit before agreeing to restore power to the site, treating Wade as a liability rather than a customer. County officials mailed formal warnings about overgrown vegetation, unresolved safety violations, and outstanding land taxes, each letter a small reminder that the clock on Caldwell Ridge was already running. A few contractors came out to survey the property and quoted him fair prices, only to call back days later and quietly withdraw once they learned Ashcroft's name was somewhere in the airfield's history. It was during this stretch of mounting rejection that Travis Callahan reappeared in Wade's life, an old friend who had once worked as an air traffic controller at Caldwell Ridge before the facility went dark. Travis remembered the airfield differently than everyone else did, not as a failure, but as a functioning artery that had once handled medical transport flights, cold chain cargo, and sensitive defense components on a tight, well-run schedule. He told Wade, almost offhand, that Caldwell Ridge hadn't died from irrelevance. It had died because somebody with real power had decided it was more useful gone than running. That single sentence lodged itself in Wade's mind and refused to leave, especially once he thought again about the locked cabinet marked Federal Relay Access sitting untouched in the back office. With Travis's help and a set of tools better suited to old, stubborn locks, Wade finally opened that filing cabinet on a quiet evening after the sun had already gone down over the runway. Inside were cable diagrams, note identification codes, and an operating permit for the airfield's auxiliary systems that had never actually been marked terminated, only suspended, a distinction Wade now understood carried enormous weight. Travis studied the documents in silence for a long moment before saying quietly that whoever shut this place down had left in a hurry, or hadn't wanted anyone paying close enough attention to notice what was actually here. For the first time since signing his name in that crowded auction room, Wade allowed himself to consider the possibility that Celeste Ashcroft had sold him something far more valuable than she understood, and that the joke everyone had laughed at might not belong to him. Money became the next battle, and Wade fought it the only way he knew how, by selling what little he had left and working every angle available to a man with more skill than capital. He sold his old pickup truck for less than it was worth, pawned a set of specialty tools he had collected over years of freelance aircraft repair, and took on overnight maintenance jobs for a small charter company willing to pay cash. He did not rush to reopen Caldwell Ridge as a full commercial airfield because he understood that ambition without cash flow was just another way to fail quietly. Instead, he built towards something smaller and faster to activate, a temporary storage yard for aviation parts, a maintenance apron for aircraft in transit, an emergency refueling stop, and a modest cold storage transfer point for perishable freight that needed somewhere reliable to land at odd hours. Mara filed the paperwork for a phased reactivation rather than a full relicensing effort, a strategy that would let Wade begin generating income from limited operations while the larger application worked its way through regulatory review. Travis reached out to a handful of contacts still working in overnight freight, men and women who remembered him fondly and were willing to take a chance on an old friend's new venture. Wade repainted the airfield signage himself, cleared out the operations office by hand, and rebuilt sections of the runway lighting system using salvage parts and stubborn patience rather than money he did not have. He slept most nights on a cot in that same office, ate from cans more often than not, and called his daughter Mara every evening without fail, always keeping his voice steady even when the day behind him had been anything but steady. Word of Wade's reactivation filing eventually found its way back to Celeste, and this time she did not laugh. She ordered her legal team to conduct a full review of every asset Ashcroft had sold off in recent years, a request that unsettled more than a few people in that department who understood exactly what kind of scrutiny that implied. A young attorney combing through the Caldwell Ridge sale agreement discovered with visible discomfort that Celeste's own signature had authorized an unusually clean transfer, one that included not just the land, but every piece of supporting infrastructure, every dormant permit, and every technical record tied to the site. Celeste read the document twice, her expression tightening with each pass, because the humiliation she had orchestrated for Wade in that auction room had, without her realizing it, handed him everything he needed to rebuild what she assumed was already debt. The turning point that no one saw coming arrived on a stormy night when a medical transport company found itself desperate. Its usual ground routes flooded and impassable, and every larger regional airfield already fogged in or overwhelmed with diverted traffic. Wade received the call just after midnight, and without hesitation he opened Caldwell Ridge for emergency use, guiding the aircraft down using the lighting system he had rebuilt himself from salvaged parts and sheer stubbornness. The cargo aboard that flight included a set of donor organs bound for a transplant recipient whose surgical window was measured in hours, not days, and every minute mattered more than anything else happening anywhere else in the state that night. By morning, local news outlets were running a story about a supposedly dead airfield that had quietly saved a life-critical shipment when every larger option had failed. For the first time since Wade signed his name in that crowded auction room, his phone began ringing for reasons that had nothing to do with debt collectors or code violations. Freight companies, medical transport services, and small charter operators started calling to ask about landing slots, storage rates, and whether Caldwell Ridge could handle recurring business rather than a single emergency favor. Wade answered every call personally, still cautious, still careful not to overpromise capacity he wasn't yet sure he could deliver. But something in him had shifted the moment that emergency flight touched down safely. The airfield that Celeste had handed him as a joke had just proven in the most public way possible that it was still capable of doing exactly what it was built to do decades earlier. 3 months after the sale, Caldwell Ridge no longer. And she was the one who didn't seem to understand what she had actually sold. Unable to buy Wade out, Celeste turned to influence instead, pressuring several members of the county board to schedule an emergency safety hearing that could, if it went her way, suspend Caldwell Ridge's operations entirely. The hearing became the most tense confrontation of the entire conflict, staged in a public room filled with reporters, business owners, and a handful of officials who owed Ashcroft favors they weren't eager to discuss openly. Daphne Vale opened the proceedings by projecting photographs of the airfield taken more than 6 months earlier, images of crumbling terminals and overgrown runways clearly meant to suggest nothing had meaningfully changed since Wade's disastrous purchase. Celeste sat near the back with the calm posture of someone who believed she had already won, occasionally exchanging quiet glances with board members who had promised Ashcroft new commercial development in exchange for their cooperation. Wade stood before the board without theatrics, presenting current data rather than argument, runway inspection results, lighting system certifications, employment figures for the jobs Caldwell Ridge had created, and documentation from the medical transport company whose cargo had once depended on his airfield during an emergency no one else could handle. Mara followed by producing evidence that the photographs Daphne had shown were outdated by more than half a year, deliberately selected to mislead the board rather than inform it, a revelation that visibly unsettled several officials in the room. Travis then delivered the hearing's most damaging blow, presenting historical records proving Caldwell Ridge hadn't closed years earlier due to declining value, but because Ashcroft had deliberately rerouted regional freight traffic toward a private airfield it owned outright, a decision that had cost the surrounding community its fastest medical transport corridor for years. The room fell into stunned murmuring as officials began to grasp that Celeste's company bore direct responsibility for damage it had spent years quietly concealing. One board member, an older woman who had lived in the county her entire life, asked aloud why nobody had ever brought these records forward before, her voice carrying the particular anger of someone realizing her community had absorbed a private company's decision as an unavoidable tragedy rather than a deliberate choice. Another official, visibly uncomfortable, admitted under quiet questioning that Ashcroft representatives had discussed future development incentives with several board members in the weeks leading up to the hearing, an admission that landed like a second, quieter scandal on top of the first. Wade did not press his advantage further than the facts required, understanding that overreaching in that moment would hand Celeste a sympathy narrative she did not deserve. Instead, he simply waited, letting silence do the work that anger might have undone, while reporters in the back row filled entire notebooks with the kind of material that would dominate coverage for weeks afterward. Celeste was cornered, but not yet finished, raising one final legal argument that the underground data relay system technically belonged to a federal program and had never been properly transferred to civilian ownership. Before the board could rule on anything, chaos interrupted the hearing entirely when an urgent call reached Caldwell Ridge, informing Waite that a shipment of temperature-sensitive cargo worth $80 million had become stranded after a major regional airport's coordination systems failed unexpectedly. Waite had exactly one night to prove that everything he had built over 6 difficult months was more than paperwork and good intentions, a test far larger and far more public than anything a hearing room could produce. He left the meeting immediately, Mara and Travis close behind him, the fate of Caldwell Ridge suddenly resting on what would happen before sunrise rather than on anything decided by a vote. The crisis had begun hours earlier at one of the region's largest airports, where a coordination system failure had left dozens of cargo flights stacked in a bottleneck with nowhere efficient to go. Among the stranded shipments were medical supplies, semiconductor components, energy equipment, and delicate aviation parts, each hour of delay translating into losses that would ripple through entire industries by morning. Bennett Kingsley called Waite directly as the crisis unfolded, telling him plainly that if Caldwell Ridge could absorb even a fraction of that stranded traffic successfully, the entire industry would be forced to view him differently by sunrise. Resembled the graveyard everyone had once mocked, though it remained far from the empire it would eventually become. It functioned instead as a quiet, disciplined overnight transfer point, handling medical shipments, aircraft parts, precision agricultural equipment, and specialized technology components that needed a reliable landing spot away from the congestion of larger hubs. Waite built the business methodically, stacking small, dependable revenue streams on top of one another rather than chasing a single dramatic contract, landing fees here, cold storage income there, a maintenance agreement, a hangar lease, an office rental for a logistics coordinator who needed somewhere quiet to work. None of it was flashy, but all of it was real. And real income, Waite had learned long ago, was the only kind that mattered when the people around you were waiting for you to fail. Bennett Kingsley, a reclusive but formidable investor behind Kingsley Dominion Capital, first heard Waite's name buried inside a routine logistics report that crossed his desk almost by accident. What caught his attention wasn't the story of the humiliating sale, which he found mildly amusing, but the geography, because Caldwell Ridge sat almost perfectly within a gap between 3 overburdened regional hubs that were constantly straining under freight volume they couldn't fully absorb. Bennett understood in a way most people in that industry did not, that a well-positioned auxiliary field with the right infrastructure could eventually become worth an amount of money that would embarrass most people's imaginations. He made a note to watch Caldwell Ridge quietly without revealing his interest, the way a patient man watches a promising seed before deciding whether it's worth the water. Celeste, meanwhile, grew increasingly irritated as a handful of Ashcroft's own cargo clients began quietly rerouting shipments through Caldwell Ridge to avoid delays at their usual hubs. Daphne Vale suggested a more aggressive response, framing Waite publicly as an inexperienced operator who had inflated the value of a worthless property through reckless overpromising, and Celeste approved the plan without much hesitation. A negative article soon appeared under a headline questioning whether a single father with no formal aviation management background could realistically run an airport, filled with pointed language designed to plant doubt in the minds of anyone considering doing business with him. Waite did not respond with outrage or defensive statements because he understood that anger rarely survived contact with hard numbers. Instead, Waite published his operational data openly for anyone willing to look, safety records showing 0 incidents, cargo handling times that outperformed several larger competitors, cold storage certification completed ahead of schedule, and a maintenance calendar followed with obsessive precision. The local community, many of whom now worked in jobs Caldwell Ridge had created, rallied behind him without needing to be asked because they had watched him rebuild the place with his own hands rather than inherited wealth. It didn't take long before an independent journalist traced the negative article's funding back to a media firm with financial ties to Ashcroft Aeronautics, a discovery that shifted public sympathy sharply in Waite's direction. People began asking a question that Celeste had clearly never expected to face publicly: why exactly a corporation of Ashcroft's size would feel threatened by an airfield it had once dismissed as worthless. It was in the middle of that shifting public mood that Bennett Kingsley finally reached out directly, calling Waite himself rather than sending an intermediary, a gesture that signaled genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. Bennett told him plainly that he had no interest in purchasing the airfield outright because ownership wasn't the point. What he wanted to understand was exactly how large Waite intended to build whatever he was building. Wade answered honestly, admitting he hadn't fully mapped the ceiling of his own ambition yet. He had simply been focused on surviving one obligation at a time since the day he signed that contract. Bennett found that answer more convincing than any polished pitch could have been, and he told Wade he would be sending a technical team to evaluate the site's infrastructure in the coming weeks. Wade allowed Bennett's engineers onto the property, but he remained deliberately guarded about certain details, particularly the old federal relay cabling system still buried beneath the operations bunker. Travis eventually laid out the full history for Wade in plain terms, explaining that Caldwell Ridge had once served as a relay node for Federal Aviation Coordination and Emergency Response Networks, infrastructure abandoned rather than removed once the associated program lost funding years earlier. Wade began to understand that combining functioning runways, growing freight volume, and a dormant but intact data relay system could transform Caldwell Ridge into something far larger than a simple cargo stopover, a genuine intelligence hub for regional air logistics capable of routing freight in real time and easing pressure on overloaded larger airports. Mara discovered buried within an older regulatory filing that subsurface infrastructure rights had transferred along with the land itself, provided any future use didn't violate existing federal security restrictions. Wade filed for civil use certification almost immediately, understanding that approval could multiply the airfield's practical value overnight in a way that had nothing to do with runway length or hangar space. When word of that filing reached Celeste through a contact on the county board, she moved quickly, instructing her attorneys to send a formal letter demanding the original sale be voided on the grounds that Wade had misused a transferred asset beyond its intended scope. Mara countered without hesitation, pointing out that Celeste's own signature had authorized an unrestricted transfer with no limitations on future use whatsoever, a fact that left Ashcroft's legal position considerably weaker than Celeste wanted to admit. Realizing confrontation wasn't working, Celeste shifted tactics entirely, offering Wade $2 million to walk away from Caldwell Ridge and let Ashcroft quietly reabsorb the property. For a man who had sold his truck and slept on a cot for months, that figure represented more security than he had ever known in his life. And yet Wade declined without visible hesitation. When Celeste raised the offer to $10 million, clearly startled that money alone wasn't closing the deal, Wade still refused, understanding by then that what he had built was worth infinitely more than any number Celeste was prepared to offer him. Her composure finally cracked during that final call, and she told him coldly that he had no idea who he was up against. Wade answered simply "Th." Wade did not need convincing because he had spent his whole life waiting for a moment exactly like this one, a chance to prove that what he'd built wasn't a fluke born of one lucky emergency flight months earlier. He assembled his small team with a calm efficiency that surprised even those who had worked beside him for months, placing Travis in the temporary control tower to manage incoming traffic, sending Mara to handle emergency permitting with the speed the situation demanded, and directing his cold storage staff to bring every system online at full capacity. Local truck drivers who had come to know Caldwell Ridge over the preceding months were mobilized onto new routes within the hour, coordinated through a system Wade had quietly refined using the very data relay infrastructure Celeste's lawyers had just tried to claim didn't belong to him. He did not shout instructions or panic under pressure, dividing responsibilities with the steady clarity of a man who had spent years imagining exactly this kind of night, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Celeste watched developments unfold from her office downtown, initially convinced that Wade would inevitably falter under the weight of an emergency this large and this public. Instead, flight after flight touched down cleanly, cargo moved into storage with practiced efficiency, and trucks pulled away on schedule as if Caldwell Ridge had been running at this scale for years rather than months. The dormant data relay system beneath the operations bunker allowed Wade's small team to coordinate arrivals and departures faster than several of the region's larger, better-funded hubs managed that same night, a fact that stunned even Bennett's own engineers watching remotely. Daphne, monitoring local coverage for any opportunity to spin the story against Wade, instead found local news crews broadcasting the scene live, sharing images of cargo aircraft landing in steady succession under runway lights that had been dismissed as worthless wreckage barely 6 months earlier. In the middle of the night's controlled chaos, Wade's phone buzzed with a message from his daughter, who had seen the coverage and wanted him to know that people were saying his airfield had saved the entire night's freight operation. Wade allowed himself only a brief glance at the screen before returning to the work in front of him, though something in his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the quiet weight of vindication settling over him without any need for tears or speeches. He did not think about Celeste in that moment, or about the laughter in that Denver conference room 6 months earlier, only about the next aircraft on approach and the drivers waiting to receive ET. By the time the sun rose over Caldwell Ridge, every stranded shipment had been processed successfully, and Bennett Kingsley called personally to announce a strategic investment of $600 million into what he now called Wade's logistics ecosystem, a name that would soon appear on a freshly painted sign as Harlan Airworks. 6 months after the day Celeste sold him a supposedly worthless airfield, Caldwell Ridge bore almost no resemblance to the wreckage Wade had first walked through with a borrowed flashlight. The old terminal building had become a fully staffed coordination center, humming with activity around the clock. The cold storage facilities had tripled in capacity, and short-range cargo drones now completed test routes overhead on a regular schedule. Freight companies signed long-term contracts without hesitation. Land values in the surrounding area climbed steadily, and people who had once laughed at Wade in that Denver conference room now requested meetings just to shake his hand. Ashcroft Aeronautics, by contrast, spiraled into crisis, losing major logistics clients and facing mounting scrutiny over accusations that it had once deliberately engineered Caldwell Ridge's decline to protect a competing private airfield it owned. Celeste's standing within her own company eroded steadily as the board grew increasingly uneasy about the unfolding revelations, and matters worsened considerably when Ashcroft discovered it needed access to Caldwell Ridge's data relay network to salvage a defense contract worth billions of dollars. There was a bitter irony in that necessity that Celeste could not ignore, no matter how she tried. The airfield she had once treated as a punchline had become the single asset capable of saving the very deal her career now depended on. She had no choice but to drive out to Caldwell Ridge herself, a trip that felt entirely different from every previous visit she had ever paid to that stretch of land. There were no chandeliers waiting for her this time, no laughter, no room full of people eager to hear her next clever remark. Celeste stood at the airfield's gate while a security guard politely asked whether she had a scheduled appointment, a simple question that landed with unexpected weight because the place she had once dismissed as garbage no longer opened its doors to her without notice. She waited longer than she wanted to admit before being escorted inside, past facilities she barely recognized, toward an operations office that had once been mold-streaked and abandoned and now looked out over a runway lit with steady, purposeful activity. Wade met her in that office without ceremony, offering neither warmth nor hostility, simply the calm attention of a man who had learned there was no need to perform anger he no longer felt. Celeste tried to maintain her usual composure, proposing a partnership framed as an opportunity for Ashcroft to help Wade expand nationally, though both of them understood the true balance of power in that room had shifted permanently. Wade said little in response, instead placing a prepared contract on the desk between them, one that laid out terms far removed from anything resembling the casual, humiliating transaction that had started this entire chapter of both their lives. The terms were direct and unambiguous, requiring Ashcroft to publicly acknowledge Caldwell Ridge's true value, transfer a portion of its Western logistics network to Harlan Airworks, provide compensation to the surrounding community for the years of lost medical transport capability caused by the airfield's original closure, and grant Wade's company operational authority over key coordination functions going forward. Celeste read through the document twice, her expression tightening the way it had months earlier when her own attorney first realized how thoroughly she had transferred every advantage to Wade without meaning to. She had once sold him an entire airfield for $1,234 as a cruel joke, and now the price of walking back through that gate as anything other than a stranger was nothing less than a portion of her own company's future. Wade spoke evenly without triumph in his voice, telling her simply that she had sold him a dead airfield, and all he had done differently was see that it was still breathing when everyone else had already given up on ET. Celeste had no clever response left because for the first time since that day in the Denver conference room, there was no audience left to perform for, only the quiet reality of a decision she could not undo. She signed the contract not because she wanted to, but because there was no version of Ashcroft's future that survived without doing so, and both of them understood that plainly as her pen moved across the page. Celeste's exit from her position as chief executive followed not long after, framed publicly as a restructuring decision though everyone within the industry understood its true origin, and she was ultimately absorbed into a diminished advisory role within the very alliance Wade now controlled the terms of. Bennett Kingsley became a formal strategic partner in Harlan Airworks, though Wade retained full operational authority over Caldwell Ridge itself, unwilling to hand away the one thing he had rebuilt with his own hands and his own patience. Mara Whitman accepted a permanent position as lead counsel for the growing company, and Travis Callahan took over as director of flight operations, a role that finally matched the years of quiet expertise he had never stopped carrying with him. None of them celebrated with excess, because all of them understood the value of what they had built came from steadiness rather than spectacle. The town around Caldwell Ridge changed alongside the airfield itself, slowly and then all at once, the way small places tend to change when something real finally roots itself there. New jobs pulled young families back who had once left for larger cities. A diner near the county road stayed open later to serve overnight freight crews, and local schools began fielding questions from students who wanted to know how someone learned to read a runway the way Wade did. He never positioned himself as an example for anyone, deflecting most of that attention back toward Travis, Mara, and the drivers and technicians who had shown up in the hardest months without knowing whether they would ever be paid properly. Even Daphne Vale, once the architect of the campaign meant to bury him, eventually sent a private message acknowledging that she had been the first person inside Ashcroft to recognize the company had thrown away something it never understood, though she stopped short of calling it regret. Wade did not humiliate Celeste publicly, the way she had once humiliated him in front of an entire room of investors, choosing instead to let the facts speak for themselves without additional cruelty attached. That restraint said more about who he was than any victory could have, because his satisfaction came not from watching someone else fall, but from proving that value could be built honestly by someone willing to look closely at what everyone else had already dismissed. Late one afternoon, he walked the length of the main runway alone, remembering the rusted keys, the laughter in that crowded room, the night spent sleeping on a cot with nothing but stubbornness keeping him company. When Mara called to ask if he felt proud, Wade watched a cargo plane taxi toward the runway and told her simply that he was glad this place finally got to hear its engines running again. Inside the newly renovated lobby, the old crooked Caldwell Ridge airfield sign was mounted carefully behind glass, preserved rather than discarded, a small plaque beneath it reading that it had been purchased for $1,234 and rebuilt by people who refused to quit. A reporter visiting weeks later asked Wade what empire he intended to build next, expecting perhaps a name, a number, or an ambitious new venture to announce. Wade looked out toward the runway instead, watching another aircraft lift steadily into the evening sky, and answered quietly that it wasn't about building an empire at all, only about finding a way home for the things everyone else had already decided to forget.